Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Baker. We're going to continue with my series on biology videos. This is Unit 6 for my class, and we're going to talk about evolution, specifically something called microevolution this unit. And as always, if you've got access to my slides, there's a copy to the unit vocab in the corner of this one. Right. So our learning goals as we start off this unit are: how does a species' genome change over time, and how do different events in the environment affect the genome of a species? So remember, genome is just the hard copy DNA of a species, not necessarily the individual's, but an individual's DNA can have an impact on the species' genome over time, and that's something we're going to talk about. Another thing to talk about, remember, is that phenotypes are what stuff looks like, not necessarily the DNA itself. The genome are the specific alleles in that DNA. Right? So some of the things we've talked about in the previous units are going to keep coming up as we talk about more and more genetics, just in a little bit different light. So remember that that genetic engineering we talked about last unit with selective breeding, that's something called artificial selection, right? You might have heard of other things like artificial intelligence. This is kind of similar, right? We've got a outside force acting on a genome here, but that outside force has a specific goal in mind. So genetic engineering with selective breeding is just a type of artificial selection, right? It's not happening naturally out in the environment. It doesn't have as much randomness to it. It doesn't have a specific reaction to a stimuli, like the change in prey or predators in the environment. This is the actual interaction between humans and the genome of a species. All right, and we talked specifically about dog breeds and selective breeding for plants, especially crops, in the last unit. So we're not going to go too in depth with that. I just want you to remember that. Keep it in your mind as we move forward. All right, so if that was artificial, this is natural. All right, natural selection is based on having individuals that are more equipped for survival. So those that are better at surviving in their environment will live, while those who are less equipped for survival will die. All right, and that's important because the ones that live can reproduce more, and if they're reproducing more, the traits that make them equipped for survival are going to get passed on to the next generation, and that's going to continue happening as the generations pass and more matings take place. So those traits that are beneficial are going to spread to more individuals through mating, right? The offspring are going to inherit traits of the parents, something we've already talked about with genetics, and more of them are going to have those traits because generally we see species giving birth to more individuals than take part in the mating, right? So if you've got two parents, generally there's more than two kids. And these changes to traits are going to arise due to something called selective pressures. This is also called evolutionary pressures. It just kind of depends on who you're talking to and where they're from in the world. Some regions of the globe call it one thing, while others call it another. Right? So selective pressures is just what I'm going to be calling it, but you might see it called evolutionary pressures other places. And that's when some outside force that's not a human specifically trying to do it, allows an individual of a species to have better chances of reproducing than others inside the population. Right? Remember that the population is the part of the species that lives in a specific location. All right? So this could happen because of competition. There could be individuals in the population that are competing for resources, prey, or food like plants. Right? So if one individual is going to be able to eat more, that means they are going to live longer and they're going to be able to reproduce more and pass those traits on to their offspring. Right? Another common selective pressure is predation. If a predator eats an individual, that individual can't continue mating and passing on their genes. So those genes get removed from something called the gene pool, which is just the genome as a whole, and they're not being passed down to the next generation. Right? Another one that is common is their ability to attract a mate. Many species have evolved over time the ability to attract mates and attract mates well. So the females generally are going to look for something in the male of the species that makes them want to mate with them. It's going to change based on species, and it's going to change even based on different populations sometimes, right? So things like a sorry, I had to cough. Like a peacock or a parrot that attracts the mates based on the color of its tail. All right. So those kind of things are going to impact how much traits are able to be passed down to the next generation. Because if you're unable to attract a mate, you're not going to reproduce. And if you're not reproducing, you're not passing on your traits to the next generation. Right. The picture below me is a species called the peppered moth, and it has two morphs. And morphs are just colors, right? So these morphs are light and melanic or dark morphs, right? The light morph blends in with specific trees and rocks more easily than the dark morph, but they each will blend into different environments, right? They can still intermate, and the light morph and dark morph can produce differently colored offspring. A pair of light morph parents could produce both light and dark morph offspring, and vice versa. All right. As you can see in the picture, sometimes the light morph does blend in better, sometimes the dark morph blends in better. This is a response to predation. All right, so the dark morphs are going to be able to avoid predation in the darker areas, whereas the light morphs are going to avoid predation in the lighter areas. And this change in frequency of those two different morphs, the two different colors, came about during the Industrial Revolution when there was a lot more pollution in the air, and it actually had an effect on the color of bark and stones around urban environments. Right? Specifically, London is one that's talked about a lot with the peppered moth. Right? So there are three generally types of selective pressures. There's stabilizing pressure, disruptive pressure, and directional pressure. All right. And we define them based on what they select against. All right. And the next slide kind of explains that more. Right. I know that my head's covering one of them. It's covering the words disruptive selection. All right. So directional selection is going to select against one extreme on this kind of bell curve of allele frequencies. Right? So the example here is a tail length for a lizard. Right? So a long wiggly tail can look like a snake and scare predators off, but it also makes it easier to catch. So a lot of times those long tails can be detached and then regrown. But this selection pressure is pushing the new generations to have longer tails because those with shorter tails aren't scaring off predators as much. So they're getting eaten, which doesn't allow them to actually pass on the trait for shorter tails, while the longer tail is being passed down. Stabilizing pressure is going to stabilize toward the middle and away from the extremes. All right. And you can see this graph. The dashed line is the original population, and the solid line is after the selection pressure has taken place. So this is towards moderate traits. Right. So this example is felines and tail length again, just to keep it simple. So the shorter tails and the longer tails can both mess up balance on the ground and affect the speed of a cat. And that's going to affect, depending on which species it is, but it's going to affect avoiding predators and catching prey, because a faster cat can catch prey more easily and avoid predators more easily. So the cat that can eat more and survive longer is going to pass on its traits to the next generation. So those with medium length tails are going to be able to pass their traits on more often. With a ground squirrel, all right, that's the disruptive selection example on my side of the screen. This is a selection against a medium. So it's towards the outsides, towards the extremes. Right? So both short tails and long tails have uses. Right? And eventually, disruptive selection can lead to something called speciation, which is an actual change in how we describe those individuals, and they're now regarded as completely different species. Right? So short tails are going to be much better for ground squirrels because it's going to give them the ability to get away from predators more often. Predators can't grab a hold of the tail, and it can make them go a little faster because they don't have as much weight in the back, dragging them down. But if you are a tree squirrel, you're going to want the longer length of tail because of the balance. So think about like tree squirrels and chipmunks, right? Medium tails don't help either environment that the population would live in, and eventually it does lead to speciation, chipmunks and squirrels, or ground squirrels, which is a type of chipmunk. All right. We also see this with phenotype changes within a species. All right. So this can be based on predators like the peppered moth. All right. So this is just giving you another example. We've got directional selection favoring either lighter or darker phenotypes. The graph is showing a favoring of the dark phenotype, right? A disruptive selection would pressure against, so it would select against a medium fur color, but the lighter and the darker fur colors would be okay. So they would live on to pass their species phenotypes down to the next generation. A stabilizing selection would favor against the lightest and the darkest, but the medium fur color phenotype is going to get passed down. So you can see how each of these is going to represent a different response to a selective pressure. Right? We're going to go over this more in the upcoming week if you're part of my class. All right, so we talked a little bit about how a species genome changes over time. That's going to be something we're talking about all unit, really. So keep that question in mind as we continue learning about evolution. And we talked about how different events in the environment can affect the genome of a species. We're going to look at more specific examples as this week progresses if you're in my class. As always, keep learning and keep asking questions.